Thank you guys for coming. Sorry for the delay. You know, this is a retro technology fest, so we have to have some sort of technical issue whenever I'm presenting. So, but it's all good. These guys are awesome. So, thank you guys for coming. Well, my name is Tim Lapetino, and I am the author of the book Art of Atari. And today I'm going to be talking about Pac-Man. And just a little bit about me. You know, I like pictures of myself, so I put another one up here. Everybody, you probably love it too. I'm a graphic designer in my sort of day job, and I'm also a sometime writer. And you know, a lot of times I find myself working at the intersection of pop culture and design. You know, in my day gig, I design packaging and logos and print things like books. And you know, I've been a video game guy since my Atari days. You know, and those really never ended, but they started in the '80s. And a lot of that has driven my visual sense, you know, in the intervening years. So after almost, 15 years as a designer, a couple years ago, I found myself on the other side of the table, writing and art directing a book of my own. It's The Art of Atari. 5 years of work and flying all over and driving all over the country and hunting in scary basements and awesome archives of museums and, you know, trolling eBay like it was my job. We came out with this Art of Atari book. And, you know, in the process of sort of researching and curating all this art and writing the book, I was sort of reminded afresh how much I love that place where pop culture and design meet. You know, and as a designer, that's kind of the lens that I look at things through. But, you know, when people write about design, I think they often end up writing to an audience of other designers, which, you know, it's fine. There's totally a place for that. I mean, my bookshelves are, you know, many little IKEA cubbies full of those kinds of books. But I wanted to write about, you know, exploring the stories that we tell in pop culture and, you know, and where that sort of meshes with creativity, but through the lens of design. I am a, you know, retro gamer through and through. You know, give me anything with more than 4 buttons on the controller and I'm lost. That's my way of thinking about it, but I didn't see a lot of people looking at this stuff through the lens of design. So you know, I think, you know, not to put too fine a point on it, but, you know, I think designers, we sort of look at the world a little different way, you know. We're used to working with people across disciplines, you know, illustrators and developers and writers and, art directors. We're used to sort of helping bring all those things together. Right? And, you know, we know how to curate, we know how to tell stories visually. And so I feel like there's a lot of other great stories to be told from that perspective. And so the next one, you know, when I was looking at, you know, okay, we did Art of Atari. I worked with the great Steve Hendershot on a book all about Street Fighter, you know, and then I was thinking about, okay, what's the next thing that I want to tackle? And I realized that it was kind of just, he has always been there right in front of me, you know, for almost 40 years now. Little and yellow. I think you know who it is, right? In 1980, and this is old news for a lot of you. You know, a lot of us lived through this. But you know, there's one game that kind of changed entertainment and changed the nascent video game industry. You know, in May of that year, this intriguing maze-style arcade game called Pacman was released in Japan. You know, and it defied the current video game conventions of the time, and it found some success in Japan. But it was in the U.S. that Pac-Man, you know, now he was Pac-Man instead of Puck-Man, you know, famously to make sure that you couldn't scratch out the P to form dirty words. It became a sensation. You know, Pac-Man was this gigantic smash, right? By 1982, it had sold an estimated 400,000 cabinets and brought in an estimated $2.5 billion adjusted for today in quarters over its lifespan. And it was this crazy success, and it totally crossed over into pop culture, and it became one of the most successful video game franchises of all time. You know, it had spawned television series, merchandise, and more than 40 spin-off games and sequels. I mean, that's crazy, right? You know, and people look back on it, you know, and this is a question I've been asking myself a lot. You know, why? You know, why did it appeal to men and women, young people, old people? It was sort of one of the first 4-quadrant success stories. You know, they talk about that in Hollywood. Does it meet all 4, you know, young, old, you know, cool, you know, they call it 4 quadrants, make sure like everyone loves it, right? You know, but the question is why, you know, and I think for me as a designer, I think that the answer lies kind of at the heart of the game's creation. You know, and this popular myth, you've probably all heard, the creator, well, and I'll talk about him in a moment here, they said that it began with a pizza. You know, they pulled a slice out of the pizza, and this young video game developer said that that's how it began. His name was Toru Iwatani, and it still is. But he was 22 years old. You know, a self-taught video game developer at Namco Industries Limited, and he began working on his first game. You know, a game that he already believed that would stand out amongst a sea of other arcade games. You had all these shooters and these shoot-'em-up games, and I thought this was really interesting in researching this. I came across this quote, and he said that he explained it this way. He said, and I'm going to quote so that I'm quoting him accurately. He says, first of all, the kanji word teberu, to eat, came to mind. Game design, you see, often begins with words. I started playing with the word and making sketches in my notebook. All the computer games available at the time were the violent type, war games, and space invader types. There were no games that everyone could enjoy, especially none for women. I wanted to come up with a comical game women could enjoy. So he worked with programmer Shigeo Funagi and the composer Toshio Kai, a hardware engineer and a cabinet designer on this game, and after like a year and a half, the game was released on May 22nd in 1980. And the good thing about it is this was sort of an out-of-the-box solution, but Iwatani had a benefactor and a collaborator in Masaya Nakamura, who was the founder of Namco. And the company got its start manufacturing amusement rides, but eventually they pivoted, and they grew into the third largest video game company in the 70s and 80s. Nakamura led Namco in this era, and he was really one of the premier people to help him make them really one of the standout arcade companies. And so for that, a lot of people call him, and this is sort of confusing for us in the U.S., I think, but they call him the father of Pac-Man. I think maybe more accurately the grandfather, the godfather. I don't know. I mean, we could get into the mafia, but I think the idea is that he was on board with this. They saw this where other people maybe didn't see the promise and the possibility in this game. And it's really interesting because Iwatani had envisioned and designed this game around this sort of primal, fundamental act of eating, right? The pizza story. And he did later say that this pizza story wasn't exactly true, but it made for this really good story, and that's why the legend persists, right? It's this really sticky story, pulling a slice of pizza and saying, whoa, there it is. But, whatever, it's not really true. Here, this is cool. These are some of his original sketches on graph paper, just trying to figure out what all this would look like. So, I mean, how many people here, who's familiar with Pac-Man? Raise your hand if you know Pac-Man. Everybody knows what Pac-Man is. But for the two people who grew up in a cave, maybe you're in the back row or something, Pac-Man races around this maze and he tries to eat all these dots on a single board. And chasing him are 4 ghosts, each one with different personality and movement patterns. Is that moving? No, it is actually moving. It's cool. And they try and catch Pac-Man in the act of gobbling all the dots. So if you're Pac-Man, you can avoid all these enemies and you have one weapon, right? The power pellets, I guess that's 4 weapons. Situated each of the 4 corners of the maze. And you eat one of them, Pac-Man momentarily gains the ability to turn the tables, eat the ghosts, leaving only their eyes to regenerate in the middle of the maze. So, the gameplay is fun. It's not super aggressive. It's a little whimsical. And it has this unique, this neat personality that appealed to a wide audience, right? It's very simple, super difficult to master, and it became this mega hit. And it touched off what the media started calling Pac-Man Fever. Right, so it was nothing like anything else on the market. It was totally different, but very quickly it ushered in this subgenre of maze games, and there's all these knockoffs and ripoffs and homages that just followed right behind when people realized, hey, maybe we could make a couple quarters in the same way. But so it was super successful, but there were a lot of games that were successful that we're not still talking about 38 years later, right? So my question has always been, and I feel like I'm still wrestling with that answer, is why did Pac-Man go on to become one of the most recognizable characters in American culture? A study that was done less than a decade ago said that like 94% of Americans could identify Pac-Man. I think it's more people that can identify Jesus. That's pretty serious, right? And so for me, the answer is design. I might be biased, but I think it begins with a simple design, right? You've got this iconic circle with a missing wedge. It's flat, and he's almost devoid of personality. And I think some of this is the fact that, early game hardware meant that Pac-Man's, even his chomping animation was really, really simple. And Iwatani had said that it wasn't just technology, that some of it was his team's design choices were born out of an attempt to keep things simple. And I really like this. I'm a big believer in, levels of simplicity. But he said, in Japanese, the character from the mouth is a square shape. It's not circular like the pizza, but I decided to round it out. And there was a temptation to make Pac-Man's shape less simple. While I was designing the game, someone suggested we had eyes. But eventually we discarded that idea because once we would add eyes, we would want to add glasses and maybe a mustache. It was the early 80s. There would just be no end to it, right? And I think that's a really, really interesting thing. Because it meant that the decision meant that Pac-Man was really simple, but it also meant that he didn't have a lot of personality or motivation. You don't see him and you get a sense of his pathos and his story. And that's not that unusual for early 80s games, but it was different because Pac-Man was such a singular character. And the game is really focused on what he does, this act. And I'll quote Iwatani one more time. He said, "He's an innocent character. He hasn't been educated to discern between good and evil. He acts more like a small child than a grown-up person. Think of him as a child learning in the course of daily activities. If someone tells him that guns are evil, he would be the type to rush out and eat every gun. But he would most probably eat any gun, even the pistols of the policemen who need them. He's indiscriminately eating because he's naive." And that incredibly sort of reductive design and that total lack of a storyline made Pac-Man kind of this blank canvas, right? Almost an empty vessel where both meaning and detail could be added and you wouldn't have to compromise that core character. But right away, at the very beginning, that sort of on-screen graphical representation of Pac-Man, it's not enough. From the very beginning, the character had to be changed for marketing and other visual purposes when they're trying to sell this, right? So this is an early American cabinet side art, and already they're focusing on how fast he is, because they put feet on him. And that's the last thing that you would think, oh, well, let's add feet. And now he's got these gigantic red eyes. You look at the Japanese iterations. This is similar to the arcade artwork, but this is one of the flyers, the arcade flyers. And they've depicted Pac-Man in this really funky way. But it sort of taps into the culture's tradition of kawaii, that concept of cuteness, the characters that are charming and vulnerable and almost childlike. He's got large eyes and he's almost like a little baby. And you see this thing. This is totally apparent in, Japanese visual culture, whether it's a manga or elsewhere. Hello Kitty is like a pretty good example of this, I feel like. But, now he's got arms and legs and he's got this exaggerated nose. And I think there's something really interesting. There's a little zoom in here. You look at his eyes and look at that shape. They provide this really subtle callback to the online version. And the question is, I was wondering, it's like, so is Pac-Man like this ultimate narcissist? He only has eyes for himself, But what I found is that actually this first Pac-Man iteration borrows heavily from Walt Disney of all things. So those distinctive eyes are called pie eyes. They're not Pac-Man eyes, but if you want to call them that, cool. And those and the gloves are total homages, or maybe they were just ripping off Mickey Mouse. And if you think about the time, this is 1979, 1980, there were a lot fewer examples of characters in video games. So it makes a lot of sense that the illustrators would draw from these classic Disney tropes. And you look at these like rubbery limbs and the three-fingered hands, 3 fingers and a thumb, and the pie eyes in Mickey. This is from a cartoon 1929 called The Jazz Fool, where this is the first time that I was able to find that Mickey had those pie eyes. And they appear briefly, and then you go on and Mickey goes and grows up and gets pupils and everything. So, that changes, but this was really clear that they were borrowing from this space. So I think the thing that's fascinating about Pac-Man is that he's interpreted by a variety of artists, and Pac-Man would morph every time he moved to a different console or a different platform. For the Atari 2600 home console version of this game, artist Hiro Kimura depicted Pac-Man, and he became more playful. Now his head is huge, right? And he's got this larger head, he's got pupils now, but he still has those pie shapes. He's got teeth, so he can actually execute that whole eating thing, right? And like any self-respecting, health-conscious yuppie of the 80s, he's trading in the boxing gloves and the boots for a pair of trendy sneakers and hiked-up athletic socks. You can see that, it's a little tough to see. But, and they actually almost look like Adidas, I don't know. But you see, as time goes on, Pac-Man becomes even more three-dimensional. Sometimes he has eyelids. I don't know, he kind of looks stoned there to me. But, at some point Pac-Man grows up and he gets a real job, and now he's got a fedora and work gloves. This is from the 1982 Hanna-Barbera Saturday morning cartoon, which ran for like 44 episodes over a couple of years. I mean, he's got his nuclear family. He's got to support him, right? He's got, you know, the missus, although she's a Ms. really, and they even got a baby. But you know, that's a story. We'll get to that in a minute. You know, and sometimes the differentiation of Pac-Man was just super practical, right? You know, he was altered to provide some sort of diversity and from, you know, platform to platform. This is the Atari 5200 version, also by Hiro Kimura. And this is interesting. It's the same company, same license, different platform. It's, you know, 5200 platform. And the idea is that you walk up to, you know, your Video King or your corner store or, you know, where else you bought video games in the 80s. And you notice that these are really different. But you see they're also hedging their bets a little bit. Now, Pac-Man, you know, no longer has the pie eyes, but he has some of his own merch on. You know, just in case you were wondering why he's got buck teeth, he's like, oh, I'm Pac-Man. Remember, I'm Pac-Man. Check it out. It's on, you know, this is how I roll, right? You know, and you know, it's interesting to see how, you know, the ghosts are even different. Now the ghosts have legs because, you know, they don't want to be left behind here, literally and figuratively. You know, and the maze is even a little different. The idea that now we're reinterpreting the maze as a set of castle walls, which I think is really intriguing. You know, and this is one of my favorite things. This is an amazing image, and I absolutely love it. But it really says a lot about the Wild West of the early 80s in video game IP. You know, as somebody who works with licensed, you know, characters and properties, you know, today the way things go is if you want to, you know, you want to license a property and put it on lunch boxes or bed sheets or, you know, action figures, the people who created it, they make art, they give it to you, that's what you use. Because we're all about branding, and we're all about a consistent brand experience. Well, in the 80s, it was the Wild West. You know, Atari licensed Pac-Man, and they're like, great, go make your Pac-Man. And they really didn't care, you know, as long as the checks kept coming back. Well, this is really interesting. This was the very first version of Pac-Man that Hiro Kimura designed for the Atari 2600 packaging. And it's way out there, right? You know, I mean, he's silver now, he's still got the merch on. But, you know, Pac-Man, the ghosts, you know, they called them monsters. The translation was kind of an imperfect translation to monster. You know, monster or ghost in the 80s from the Japanese to English. So these literally look like monsters, and they have these gigantic mouths and teeth. Now, this is interesting. It wasn't a full-on, you know, free form because this was actually killed. They felt like the ghosts were too ferocious. But I think it's really interesting to see where Hiro Kimura is kind of stretching these boundaries of Pac-ness, if you will. But he doesn't quite break them, right? And I think this is really interesting. I found this when I was talking to Hiro for the Art of Atari book. I had never seen this before, and no one outside of Atari had seen this until we published it in the book. And I really felt like I was Indiana Jones holding, you know, the Lost Ark of the Covenant, you know, when I opened my mail. It was amazing. So this was the first time that people in public have gotten to see this, and it was super cool. It's just really interesting. It's kind of one of those weird things. I mean, look at that. Like, that's nuts. He's totally crazy. I mean, he's running for his life. You know, he still has buck teeth. And I think it's really interesting because that version that I showed you earlier, the 5200, came after this. But you see how Hiro Kimura kind of repurposed some of those things, and they show up in the later editions. But it's pretty cool. I think there's something really interesting there. But, you know, wherever you are, the Pac-Man ethos is preserved. This is Don Mastery did this. This showed up all over licensed gear and posters and bed sheets and everything in the 80s. And it's kind of this stoic, kind of flat rendering. And you even see the line work. It's this broken line illustration that you saw in that very, very first Japanese version that came out on, you know, on the side of the Japanese cabinet and on the arcade flyers. But at the same time, it's different. You know, Pac-Man has got sort of this, he's a little bit less expressionless, but now, you know, he's a little more action-oriented. He's got legs. You know, I remember, this is one of, like, the total indelible marks of my childhood, seeing this Pac-Man. But there was more. There's a lot more. Or this, you know, this totally painterly style that comes from this tradition of children's book artwork. This is Pat McMahon, who did a lot of artwork for Bally Midway. You know, and again, he's yellow, he's large. You notice the eyes. He's got pupils and irises, but they still have the eye shape. You know, he's running. You know, although it looks like those are still Adidas. I'm not really a sneakerhead, but you know, he's still got the gloves. So apparently, he still has this germ thing. You know, and we're all just gonna not talk about that. It's okay. But you know, I think it's something funny to point out is this is the NES version of Pac-Man, made by Tengen. But you know, in every place where Pac-Man isn't wearing mittens, he generally has the 3 fingers and a thumb, and that's another like nod to classic animation, because in animation, that's something of a tradition. It's much easier to animate 3 fingers and a thumb instead of 4, and that makes it cheaper. You have to do less animation. So, you know, it also worked really well with some of those early characters that were round, so it felt like they had these, you know, more rounded hands. You got like Felix the Cat and Mickey Mouse, but even today, if you look at modern animation, you still, you know, look at Futurama or Simpsons or Tom and Jerry, all 3 fingers and a thumb. But, you know, that begs the question. You know, I've already shown you half a dozen versions of Pac-Man that all existed side by side, you know, in Pac-Man's heyday. You know, the question is, though, are some of these successful or some of them not successful? You know, it raises a question of what makes good character design. And, you know, I think that standards differ depending on whether it's for video games or film or animation. But, you know, and this is some original animation standards for, you know, how everybody should look, the sizes and all that. But, you know, for me, you know, and again, I'm not an animator. I don't work in television. I don't even play an animator on TV. But, you know, for me, I think I want to apply the principles of design to this and, you know, ask, okay, you know, how do we know if it's working? You know, here's another crazy Pac-Man, but, you know, is it believable? You know, I think the character needs to exist in some sort of reality. Does he or she or does it strike a strong silhouette? You know, is it readable and distinctive that you can tell right away who it is? Is it appropriately valued, we would say? You know, do the colors and the lighting create a focal point so that your eye is going to be drawn to that character? Is color used to tell a story? Yellow. Pac-Man owns yellow. Can you think of anybody else? You know, any other object really that owns yellow? I mean, you know, that is Pac-Man's yellow. You know, does the character fit the environment? You know, does it help to stand out in that world? I mean, think back to the original maze that we were looking at. Pac-Man is yellow, and he stands apart. He stands out on this black and blue maze. You know, and then does the character feel like it belongs in that environment? You know, and I think the answer to that question is yes, absolutely yes. You know, and as a logo designer, I also think about this overall brand that's sprung up around Pac-Man and size the character up the same way. You know, does the character meet the criterion for good branding? And we would say, is he flexible? You know, is he ownable? Is he changeable? Is he filled with some sort of, you know, symbolic power? Right? Is he recognizable? And is he distilled down to this total essence where you can't remove anymore? And I would say yes. You know, but the reality here is that we would not be talking about this if the Pac-Man games weren't awesome and fun and addictive and like fun to play. You know, whether it's a brand or a logo or a character, it's only going to be as good as the game or the media, right? And the most powerful designs in the world are going to be totally quickly forgotten if they aren't supported in that way. And I think Pac-Man has had that in spades, you know, for going on 38 years. You know, so whether the character is rendered with that thick, broken line work, or you know, even rendered in modern 3D, you know, CG animation, he still comes through as Pac-Man. You know, I like this. Check out his high tops, right? You know, Pac-Man just can't get away from the branded swag, right? Are those pumps? I don't even to see pump without you know, so I think the fundamental details remain. However, you know, whenever you're remixed, you know, maybe in vinyl toys, but I think it's just there no matter the, you know, the medium or who the creators are. I mean, although I have to admit, some of these are downright disturbing. Like these things, these Pac-Man puppets, super, super creepy, right? I mean, can you imagine having one of those things, you know, sitting on your shelf back in a dark bedroom as a kid? I mean, that's like horror movie written all over it, right? You know, Pac-Man's not there anymore. Where is he? He's under the bed, right? You know, it's super creepy. But, you know, we've seen, you know, the fundamental design of Pac-Man, you know, the color, the shape, the roundness, that just stalled. You know, it allows Pac-Man to get changed, right? This is another NES game. Here's one. This is a great version by Margaret Hudson and Pacman for the pinball game, Mr. and Mrs. Pac-Man. It was a combo pinball and video game, which is a total failure. It didn't really work. I'm sorry, this was straight up pinball machine, not a pinball game. But this is the NES version of Pac-Mania. Here we've got Pac-Man's kicking back with some suds. This came from a calendar image from Midway, and I've yet to see this actually produced. So this may be, you know, this was done at Midway, but I've never seen Pac-Man drink beer. Pat McMahon said it was a root beer. I didn't buy that at all. You know, here's another calendar image. You know, Pac-Man's sporting his ride and the vanity plate. This is kind of cool. It's a limited edition 3D statue that was put up on Kickstarter last year, or maybe a year or two ago, by sculptor Richard Olinsky, and his thing is all about polygons and taking simple shapes and making them more complex and giving them facets. And this is just wild, but it still looks like Pac-Man. Then you've got this. I'm sure everybody's seen this amazing feature film, Pixels. Pac-Man's probably the best thing about it. But you look at this character it's sort of come full circle. They sort of CG'd him and they brought him back to those simple roots, but then made him super complicated with the glowing, the internal glow of these physical pixels, and sort of remix back that original configuration, but put into another environment, which is really, really cool. It's probably the best thing about the movie, in my opinion. But the Pac-Man arcade, a lot of people consider it the first game that really had a character focus or a mascot. And the success of that title meant that Namco, and by extension Midway, the licensee, had a plethora of marketing and licensing opportunities. And this is where stuff gets real, I think. There weren't any more properties that were more ubiquitous than Pac-Man. Pac-Man showed up on everything. And this is right out of a Sears catalog. This was like my dream room in 1982. Right? You had sleeping bags. That's an adult sleeping bag, people. I just want to point that out. She is not a child. That's an adult sleeping bag. You have stickers, with those creepy, the puffy stickers with the creepy eyes. These are awesome. Lunch boxes. Who had one of these? Right on. You lost the thermos, didn't you? Right. So yeah. I'm sorry. Breakfast cereal. Right. This is and of course they had to have the marshmallows. They're not marshmallows. They're sugar, people. But they had to call them something, right? T-shirt graphics. This one kind of freaks me out a little bit. This is furniture. And it's like, okay, my chair is eating me. It's not good. And also, it's like, yeah, don't get up. That's going to bite you on the behind, right? This reminds me of a story. I was talking to a couple of folks who worked at Midway, and one worked in licensing. And this couple actually ended up getting married. They were both working there. And they were kind of road testing some of the prototype merchandise, and one of the prototypes that never made it out into production was a Pac-Man toilet seat. And they actually tested this, put that in quotes, that means what it is, on their kids, their little kids. But think about that. You sit down, what is Pac-Man eating now? Right? That's awesome. Why did that not get made? If somebody wants to kickstart that, I would totally throw my $20 in. I'd totally do that. Come on, that's a great idea. But you've got, this is what we had in the 80s in Halloween costumes, right? It's a plastic, non-breathable smock, with a mask that you can't see out of. It's totally safe, folks, totally safe, right? You've got the Pac-Man phone. Who had this? Come on, this is the best. Yeah, right back there, right on. That's amazing. Pac-Man soap is super, super cool. Even marketing events. Atari, when they did their release of the 2600, they took out a week's full of full-page ads in the New York Times, and it shows off the Pac-Man for the 2600. Pac-Man's had personal appearances. Now he's got a Nike sponsorship, apparently. That looks like a hot costume, that's all I'm gonna say. Autograph sessions. This was actually scanned from a 8x10 that Pac-Man wouldn't sign and give to you if you were a kid and you showed up at a mall, and met him. And, I think it's interesting because video games in some ways were just beginning to enter pop culture in this bigger way. Jerry Buckner and Gary Garcia created this Pac-Man inspired novelty song, and they rode the wave right at the right time. So the song Pac-Man Fever sold 1 million copies, and they got a gold record out of this. And this was absolutely the height of their career. It all kind of was sort of downhill from there. But it's a pretty big deal. How many people can say they have a gold record hanging on? And so, of course, their record company's like, you did that single? Let's do a whole album of video game songs. Does anybody remember Do the Donkey Kong? Right, yeah, a lot less people than Pac-Man Fever, right? But hey, you know what? You gotta take your shot, I guess. So, this appeal was international. I don't know, this German guy, I don't know what he's doing, but it's awesome. But I think now that Pac-Man is more exposed and he's out there in pop culture, that marketing sort of requires a storyline, right? Pac-Man needed this broader range of supporting characters, almost a family, if you will, to fully realize those opportunities, whether it was going to be more games or sequels, and moving into further media. So you have Miss Pac-Man, And the first of these was, they ended up calling her the first lady of video games. And she has her own sort of intriguing backstory. And, it's sort of an aside to what we're talking about, but I think it's so interesting because it's really this look into the old West, the Wild West days of intellectual property law. So this design, which, is very intriguing, it's by artist Tony Ramuni, who did a lot of pinball art for Midway. But Miss Pac-Man was not created by Namco. Instead, she was the brainchild of a group of MIT undergrads. And this is them. Steve Golson, Doug McRae, Kevin Curran, and others. And these guys have spoken here at Portland before, talking a little bit about this. They started by running a small arcade in their dorm rooms. And they figured out what every, arcade owner that doesn't, have now we have barcades, everything's selling free play. But, they realized that as players got better at the games, they could sit on a single quarter for, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour, 2 hours. Which, what does that mean for the arcade operators? Less money, right? So these guys decided, well, we're MIT guys, we're engineers, we're going to do something about this. So they built this hardware kit, this speed-up kit, a piece of additional hardware that would go in the cabinet and increase the difficulty of the games. So they created something they called Super Missile Attack, which was a custom board that you could supercharge Missile Command, your Atari Missile Command cabinet, and it made it super hard. Atari didn't like this, right? So they sued them. And the students, they turned it into a small business, right? And they're like, we're going to sell this product. So they sold out of the backs of magazines, and they made a whole bunch of money. And Atari sued them, and there's all this legal maneuvering. I mean, it's totally it's something that would totally happen today. But they were able to outlast this huge corporate-backed Warner Communications that owned Atari. But so Atari realized that this is a bad PR play, right? This looks really bad. Atari's suing these kids basically. But they settled out of court with Atari, and they basically took them on into everybody's perception, and they won, right? So they walked away with this big go-away settlement. But they actually, Atari said, why are you guys doing this? Why are you countersuing us? And they're like, what we really want to do is make games. So they went off and they ended up making a whole bunch of games for Atari, and they actually had a hand in the 7800. They designed a ton of hardware and software for Atari. So they kind of got what they wanted. But before they did that, they set their sights on Pac-Man. So think about this. So they just won their lawsuit at Atari, and they decided to call up Midway and say, hey, you know what? We just beat Atari. Well, you know who's next? Pac-Man. And so they created this speed-up kit. They were calling it Crazy Auto. And they worked with the folks in Midway who were really tired of chasing down illegal clones or duplicates or just knockoffs of Pac-Man, and they turned it into a bona fide sequel to the original game. Midway was like, all right, that's much better than fighting pirates and counterfeiters, and Miss Pac-Man was created. So they licensed the game. Midway was allowed to make new games under their license with Namco, and they turned Crazy Auto into Miss Pac-Man, and it was a huge success. Again. In fact, Miss Pac-Man holds the all-time sales record for a standalone video game in the U.S. Pac-Man is number 2, right? And I think it's really interesting. And it's a fascinating game, and I think other developers could even tell you more about technically why it's pretty amazing. But beyond that, Miss Pac-Man had this lasting impact because suddenly, now the merchandising and the licensing, and she's part of this extended family. They have a baby Pac-Man. I don't know. I didn't ask. Right, how did it happen? Not sure. But they have pets, and they showed up in this, Saturday morning cartoon. But I think from a design perspective, Miss Pac-Man's really interesting because at first she's basically just Pac-Man, wearing a bow, and lipstick. But then very quickly that gave way to, kind of surprisingly, a little bit more sexualized version of the character. And if you don't catch some of the symbolism here, I'm not going to say it. It's a family show, but if you don't see that, I don't know what to tell you. It just for me, it seems very odd and kind of out of place with for a game that was had such a wide appeal. But it's there. Sometimes a banana is not just a banana. So you got Miss Pac-Man, you got Baby Pac-Man, and their pets, and. GCC and Midway kept working on other games. Now you've got Junior Pac-Man and Baby Pac-Man, and Midway, for its part, they're like, this is amazing. We're going to milk this license for all it's worth. And they created pinball games and quiz games for Pac-Man. And they're basically pushing as much Pac-Man as the market can withstand. And I think that's really intriguing. And obviously it's opportunistic, but you get it, right? So and on screen, Pac-Man continued to evolve as video game technology evolves. Pac-Man's not stuck in the 80s. You continually see, game after game, as every new platform, there's some version of Pac-Man. And as the game hardware advances, so does the look and the play, and the style of the games. But yet it's still Pac-Man. You can still see Pac-Man throughout. And so, 40 years later, we're looking around and we see Pac-Man everywhere. You can go on Instagram and, do hashtag Pac-Man or looks like Pac-Man, Google search, and you see stuff like this. It's not just because the popularity of the games has kept Pac-Man in the public eye. I think, like anything, Pac-Man waxes and wanes depending on time. It's been almost 40 years. But I think the symbol is very enduring. And I think it's obvious to see that there's powerful design at work when people start co-opting it for their own uses. How am I doing on time? Time magazine used to talk about, political action committees. Scientific researchers in Norway made a tiny version of the maze to show how microscopic organisms live and eat and, and move around, these little microbes. A couple of Google programmers created the Google Doodle in 2010 based on Pac-Man. That was one of the most successful of those designs that anyone has done. Even the evangelical religious group Jews for Jesus created tracks that connected Pac-Man to spiritual themes, and they would hand these out. It's really interesting and talking about do you feel emptiness inside when you're playing? You're searching for the ghosts. It's really interesting. I don't know if it's a one-to-one, if it totally makes sense, but I think it's really intriguing that Pac-Man was such a cultural touchstone that people are talking about, how to read, you can read the Bible for yourself and see what's true here. I think it's really intriguing. But then there's beer brands who are like, we're going to use Pac-Man. This is from a Bud Light Super Bowl commercial. And I think it's very much, I can imagine the pitch meeting is like, hey, let's have a Pac-Man maze. What for? It's cool. All right, it's Pac-Man. And let's see if I can play this. Let's see if this will work. This is always hit or miss on the video, but let's see. Come on, you can do it. All right. We're apparently not going to see a totally awesome Bud Light commercial, but you can check it out on YouTube. It's pretty cool. Just somebody running around in a Pac-Man maze, and why that's relevant 36 years later, I'm not really sure. But beer, hashtag because beer. But new generations keep repurposing and changing Pac-Man and making them their own. And I think artists especially have a lot of fun kind of merging Pac-Man with other things. Pac-Man and G.I. Joe. Pac-Man and Hot Rods. This is very good. I'd like to sit in that. That's awesome. Pac-Man and gold-plated hand grenades. This is from a live-action, like a fan film. These guys were pitching an actual Hollywood-style CG Pac-Man game. Which, it's still Pac-Man. There's another slide from there. This is a piece that I love. It's called The Madness of Mission 6. And for a while, this was a threadless t-shirt. But this artist imagined Pac-Man where there's, an alternate reality where Pac-Man is actually this astronaut haunted by the ghosts of what looked like his former crew members. Did he do something nefarious to them? I'm not sure. But the only thing that's going to help him is pharmaceuticals, pills, dots, right? That he can gobble up that'll help him defeat them and sort of assuage his guilt. There's a storyline there. That's an epic. That's a prestige television series right there. But I think the idea that if you can map that much stuff onto Pac-Man, there's something about the fundamental nature of Pac-Man that is really powerful. Creepy. Yeah, it's super weird. It's like this artist, his name is Jamie Margery. He makes these things and says, what do video game characters look like in real life? And apparently that's it. It's super creepy. But, Pac-Man has taken on a life of his own, and I think the symbolism, the design, are ripe fields for people to play in, people to explore in, and I think you see the value and the strength of that design. And I think you got to give a hats off to the original creators and every generation that keeps making Pac-Man their own. So thank you guys so much for your time. Two questions.
In the 1960s, there was a famous slogan, "Happy Face Day," with a yellow happy face. Is there any connection to Pac-Man that you've been able to find?
Not that I'm aware of. Although that's really, really interesting that that's the case. I'll have to look into that more, but I've not seen that.
I would contend that kind of paved the way, because everybody was already familiar with the yellow happy face, and Pac-Man is very similar,
Yeah.
and that might have contributed to some of these.
Yeah, totally. And you see why Americans like that, because we like to eat. Right? All right, cool. Thanks. One other one. Anybody else?
Do you think there'll be some iteration of Pac-Man in like 50 years?
I think it's, I don't know. I mean, because I think if you would have gone back even 20 years ago, and people say, are you know, kids in 2018, are they still going to be playing Pac-Man? I think I would have been like, well, of course not. But, you know, absolutely are. I mean, I have a 6-year-old and 3-year-old, and I went to my 6-year-old's first grade class and it was like career day. And I told them, oh yeah, I write books about video games. And I said, you guys play video games, right? And they're like, yeah, yeah. And I said, who knows who Pac-Man is? Every single one of their hands went up. And then I had hope for this next generation. Like, you know, but I mean, like, you know, they're not old enough to figure that out on their own. And I don't think they all had parents who taught them who Pac-Man is. They just know, you know. And so I think there's a good chance. All right, I'll stick around. I'm going to be in the next panel here. So if you have questions, you can come on up and we can talk more. Thank you guys so much.